If you think that using sights in archery is cheating, you could say the same about shooting with your eyes opened. There is a very popular opinion that using sights in archery is cheating, and a lot of people will criticize modern archers for using sights. They call it a shooting aid or a crutch or a high-tech way of shooting which takes away skill, it replaces the archer, does the shooting for them, etc., etc. I've heard this thousands of times. It comes from two groups of people. The first group are traditional purists. People think anything that's any more advanced than this is a blasphemy. And I think that's a fair opinion. Archery has traditional roots. People like to keep it as traditional and natural as possible. And many people shoot with nothing more than their bow and nothing else. No tools, no accessories. That's completely fine. The other group of people will say this are non-archers, people who haven't shot before. And this is what I find a bit more confusing, is when you try to explain what a sight actually does, it comes back as, oh, it's just cheating. Now, firstly, if there's no rules, it can't be cheating. But obviously, we're not talking about a literal definition of cheating. And that's what complicates this discussion. If we're not following a common set of rules, what do you consider to be cheating? I get the feeling that many people who throw up these criticisms don't actually know what a sight does. So I want to clarify by teaching you what a sight actually does and what it doesn't do. And we're going to explore this rabbit hole of what is considered cheating as far as aiming goes. Now, what I'm holding here is a typical competitive target sight. It's bright, it's shiny, it's very orange. Now, if you look at it from the outside, it's a very modern, even high-tech looking piece of equipment. But what does the archer see? I'm going to simplify this by not having the bow in the picture, but even just holding the sight, what the archer sees is this. Now, this may seem stupidly obvious to some people, but some people have this perception of sights being this high-tech aiming device. I've had people compare this to augmented reality VR, where you can see a projected image of the path of the arrow and the bow calculates what you need to do. And honestly, that would be pretty awesome, but that's clearly not what this sight does. I'm just holding it still. I'm not trying to move it around, but I'm just holding it naturally. And this is actually a pretty good analogy to what it looks like when you're holding it. So there's nothing here which tells you exactly what to do. What the sight is a reference point. And instead of being a high-tech piece of equipment, it's actually the opposite. I've come across people who are more familiar with firearms say that using a sight is the same as using a rifle with a scope, whereas using a barebow is like shooting with iron sights. No, this is the iron sight. This is a 18th century musket with no sights. I'm not saying this to be defensive. I'm just saying this because objectively, that's the closest comparison. All this sight is a static reference point. You look at this, you overlay it on top of a target, and that's your sight picture, the same way an iron sight works on a firearm. Now, your firearm might have multiple distance settings for your sights, but for the most part, you have a sight which you zero in for a set distance and you adjust from there. Not much different from one of these. That's what this whole thing is for. It's simply a mount for which you can move your sight up and down for elevation. And there seems to be a very common misconception that the sight tells you where to aim. And it doesn't. No sight does that, whether you're shooting bows or firearms. The sight doesn't tell you where to aim. You tell the sight where you want to aim at. The sight doesn't magically guide the arrow onto the target, nor does it guide the archer or the user to aim the right spot. You can point this at the target and be aiming the complete wrong spot. To make the sight work for you, you need to have the fundamentals of form, anchor point, shoulder alignment, and so on. If you don't have the skill to use a bow, the sight doesn't actually do anything for you because you're basically going to spray the target anyway. Once you have your fundamentals, which might take months, you can then start doing sight settings. So what you do is you go out to the range, you have your distance markers, your 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 meter distances. And at each distance, you shoot until you have enough of a grouping to know that your sight is set at a certain distance. This is effectively zeroing the sight. And I say this matter-of-factly, but getting a grouping at longer distances isn't easy. Many archers simply can't group at long distance. So being able to do so already requires skill. Once you have your grouping and you pretty much know where the sight should be, you can then go, okay, so at 10 meters, my sight setting is 15 on my bar, or my 30 meter setting is 48 on the bar, and 70 meters might be 100, and so on. And you write these things down. So when you shoot at these distances, you know where to move your sight. This is the part which I think people don't see and appreciate, is the hours people spend practicing and training, and to get the sight settings, you have to go through this process. There's no shortcut behind this. And what you see in the end is, oh yeah, 70 meters, we'll move the sight down here, we'll point it at the goal and bang, in the middle. And this is disregarding execution, which is still a huge flawed part of anyone's form. To even shoot long distance accurately requires an immense amount of skill, which no equipment replaces. But if you think the sight tells you, bang, aim there, you're completely wrong, because the sight doesn't tell us that. We set the sight to where we want it to. And that means again, hundreds of hours spent in practice, fine-tuning, calibrating, goes into having the most accurate sight settings, which we record and we use when we need to. And even then, on the day, things might be different. There might be different air temperatures, there might be a change in wind, and the archer has to recognize what's going on and make the adjustment. And considering you only have a finite amount of shots to make it count, especially in knockout rounds, then it's a very intense mind game of, do I change my sight or do I assume it's correct and work from there? Point being, this is far from an automatic high-tech solution. It takes a lot of manual effort to get this right and a lot of experience to diagnose what's wrong. Now, for the non-archers who are so critical of modern sights, well, what about traditional shooting? What about barebow shooting? How do people aim with that? You do realize that people who shoot these bows still sight. So we're back with the archer's point of view. Now this time, we don't have the sight. Let's get rid of that. So what do we do instead? We use this. That's right, the arrow. Now this is a very simplistic explanation, but a lot of aiming methods use the point of the arrow as a reference. And if you're not using a sight, we're using this instead. Now, again, this is not me holding a bow, but you can imagine what I'm looking at. Imagine I'm holding the bow and I'm aiming at the big target where I'm pointing at. What I'm going to do is put the point of the arrow at the bottom of the frame. And watch what happens. And apart from shot number 5, we have a grouping. Does this surprise you? So the myth that a modern archer can't shoot without sights can easily be debunked. Now, how did I do that? Like I said before, I put the point of the arrow at the bottom of the target, the same spot each time. It's a method called gap shooting. It's one of the most natural and obvious methods which people will adopt either naturally or taught this. Basically, we have a reference point that we use to direct the arrow in the right spot each time. At a different distance, we use a different reference point. It might be a different part of the target, it might be a different part of the ground in front of it. And many people who train gap shooting will put bright colored markers like bean bags or water bottles to mark up where the reference point should be. They can't do it in the competition, but in terms of aiming and practice, they will have that visual identifier to say what the gap is. Hence why it's called gap shooting. How far from the center you point the arrow. Now again, for the non-archers, there are stranger methods to aim without sights. One of them is string walking. In string walking, you always keep the tip of the arrow pointed in the center of the target, but you change your sight settings by holding the string at a different place each time. So depending on whether you're shooting at 10, 20, 30, 50 meters, you might hold it lower or higher. And similarly, there's face walking, where again, you might put the point of the arrow in the same spot each time, but you use a different anchor point on your face to adjust for elevation. And how do we know which anchor point to use, or how far down the string to walk, or where to put the tip of the arrow? By spending hours at the range, practicing for every distance and writing down our reference points. And don't think that people don't do this. The serious competitive shooters will have a notebook with all the reference points written down. And if that sounds a little familiar, that's exactly what this is. All these sighting methods are essentially the same process. You spend hours practicing with perfect form, you record each reference point, and you adjust based on distance and conditions on the day. Where these things differ is the level of precision in which you can record your reference point. With gap shooting, or using the point of the arrow, is a visual reference point. And visually, it's very hard to be pinpoint precise with something as large as an arrow point. And even half an inch off in your reference point here can mean a foot off target over there. Face walking and string walking keep the point of the arrow static in the middle of target, so the visual reference is the same each time. So the variables come from how far you miss your anchor point or your string walk. And for the sight, we simply write down the number and we move the sight to what we need. And again, all these sighting methods have parallels. If you're using string walking, instead of writing down a number on the sight bar, you would count how many stitches are in your finger tab and move based on the number of stitches. And even if you're not using one of these more established aiming methods, a lot of beginners will figure out very quickly which part of the bow matches to which part of the target. They might use the top of the window or a certain scratch or something on the bow as a marking to judge distance. And the big point to make here is, just because you're not using a sight doesn't mean you're not sighting. And then people say, well, what about instinctive shooting? Remember, instinctive shooting isn't about not using a sight. It's about not sighting at all. You are effectively feeling where the arrow should go and adjusting from there. And to prove I'm not sighting, I'm not going to hold it full draw. I'm just going to pull it back and let it go. So no time to aim, not even anchoring completely. And this is bad technique, but again, this is purely instinctive. Even without a complete draw and complete shot process, I should still be able to hit the middle of the target. Okay, not a full draw, not an anchor. They're all defined in the same spot. Exactly the same spot. It works, and that worked pretty well at 10 meters. If I shot the same way and practiced at longer distances, I should expect a certain level of consistency. The problem is that it's far less reliable. Since I'm not using any reference points, I'm basically going by feel. The process for becoming proficient with instinctive is the same as with sights or with a different sighting method. The only difference is you're not writing down any reference points and you're not using reference points. You're simply going by feel. And again, with enough practice, you can accomplish a certain degree of accuracy, but it's always going to be the least consistent and least accurate of all the sighting methods. A lot of people have this perception that historically, archers shot instinctively. After all, there's no high-tech equipment, there's no sights, so every archer shot instinctively. Nonsense. This may be true for certain regions and styles. The Native Americans, for example, were more known for fast mobile warfare, so they would probably be shooting more instinctively. Horse archers were far more instinctive as well. That relied more on good riding skill. As long as you were riding and not falling off the horse, then you could point the bow in the direction of the target and generally hit it. Bearing in mind that the distances shot from horse archers were generally closer than foot archers. But in many other styles, we actually do have documentation of aiming methods. Gao Ying's military manual of Chinese archery, or Ming archery, as we see in The Way of Archery, as translated by Justin Ma in G10, talks about estimation and how to judge the path of the arrow to the target. And when shooting at short distance or long distance, which part of the bow to use as a reference point. The same goes for Arab archery. There's a chapter which talks about how to aim at long distance targets using the bottom part of the bow. And even English archery, for long distance shooting, they talk about underarm methods or underhand methods because the target is under the arm of the shooter. So clearly, historically, and based on the sources that we can look up, there are ways to aim the bow. So you can't say that historically all archers shot instinctively. It may be something they could do or certain styles would have done in certain situations, but by and large, archers aimed. To imagine ancient archers as shooting purely instinctively and not using any method of aiming is giving them mythical qualities, which they clearly didn't have. And on a similar note, a lot of critics of using sights will say that, ancient archers could hit the target perfectly fine without sights. The problem with saying that is that you can't prove it. We don't have objective records of what ancient archers were capable of. In a modern setting, we can judge objectively using scores. We have targets with standard scoring, so therefore we can judge the capabilities of a modern archer versus a traditional archer using a target face, either scoring points or measuring groupings. And what we see is that even the experts in instinctive shooting don't have tight groupings. They're good enough, but they're not examples of precision shooting. Precision shooting is attained through aiming, and aiming is synonymous with using a sighting method. Someone shooting instinctively, hitting the bullseye once, isn't an example of accuracy. It's called a fluke. If you're going to hit the center of a DVD-sized bullseye 72 times in a row, you're going to need more precise tools and more precise methods. And this is what we come back to after all discussion of sighting styles and methods. In the end, what we're looking at is a precision sport. If you want to be precise, you need the precise tools. And this is kind of unique to archery because we have this disconnect between the past and the present because archery wasn't used for centuries. And what we see is the what if development. What if archery was being done today? We have these new materials, we have this new equipment that wasn't possible in the past. And a lot of people don't like that, and that's fair enough. But if you take a step back from what you value more, this argument over sights being cheating or not is silly. What I equate this to is drawing a 10 centimeter line. And most people will use a ruler. But no, that's cheating. In the past, people didn't have these rulers with evenly spaced markers. So people will draw this line using a straight stick and they'll roughly measure where 10 centimeters would be. But no, you can't use a straight stick. See, the real masters of the past could draw a straight line exactly 10 centimeters long with both hands simultaneously with their eyes closed. That's what this whole argument about sights and cheating is devolving to. Ultimately, if you're choosing to practice a sport or activity which depends on precision, you shouldn't be faulted for choosing to use a more precise tool. That's the case with firearms, right? If for a firearms user, you are trying to hit the target. And if you're using sights and scopes, that's generally not seen as a bad thing. The thing with archery is that many of us are very attached to a traditional or historical view of archery. But speaking from a modern perspective, you have a choice between using a more precise tool or more precise aiming method and a less precise aiming method. And this may have been used in the past, but it's still the least consistent method. And only in archery do we see the least consistent method seen as the better thing. A modern day sniper using the most accurate rifles, the most high-tech scopes and rangefinders still isn't going to hit the target first shot every time without any preparation. They're going to spend a lot of time knowing their equipment, writing down all their range settings, and making sure that they are capable of delivering the most accurate shot possible. And that's seen as a good thing. In a test of marksmanship, a sight isn't cheating. To conclude, if you're a traditional shooter and you think that modern sights feel unnatural, that's fair enough. There's a very good reason why people love using traditional bows. But if you're not an archer and you think this is cheating, you're wrong.